Okay, and our first presentation this afternoon is Tim Strange with telegeography. He's going to be talking about 10 weird and possibly useful things you didn't know about international networking.
Thanks very much, Jeff. Most of my family and friends would agree that I am strange, but the last name is pretty strong, actually. You're not the first to do that. Okay, can everyone hear me? I believe you can. Hi, my name is Tim Strong, and I'm from the market research firm Telegeography. And I'm here to present some information on international networks and how they relate to internet businesses. And I thought it might be appropriate, since we're talking about the internet, that I structure this talk as kind of one of those top 10 lists you sort of see on the internet from time to time. Kind of like a BuzzFeed slideshow, but without all the online ads. And I do the clicking for you. You don't have to click through. Now, I know what you're thinking right now. You're probably thinking, hey, this presentation could be kind of fun. But I want to reassure you that nothing could be further from the truth. At my last presentation at NANOG Baltimore last year, I started the presentation by claiming that I was an alien and then taking off my shirt and committing various other hijinks. I had a t-shirt underneath, but yeah, so don't get too excited. No. But since that time, I've come to realize that the NANOG community is an austere, even sober group of individuals. So I want to take the moment to apologize for my past behavior and also to reassure you that in this upcoming presentation, there'll be nothing, absolutely nothing, that will be strange, funny, or remotely interesting. So to begin, this top 10 list of well, admittedly, it is called Weird Things About the International Networks. Thing number one, the machines are taking over. Now, at Telegeography, we've been tracking the makeup of international network demand for almost 25 years now. And for the longest time, we saw remarkable consistency. And that is the usage of international networks was almost always 80% allocated towards public IP backbones. IP backbone providers bought about 80% of the international networks, or the capacity on the networks. And then there's this others category. And if you see here back in 2009, these column charts that we're showing here, you can see the blue bars, the ratio of those compared to others is about 80%. And again, that reflects basically what it's been since the late 1990s when the internet exceeded voice. So what's in this catch-all others category? Well, that is switched voice. Believe it or not, there still are some international circuits dedicated to carrying PSTN voice traffic. It's things like private networks for corporations, research and education networks, and even some CDNs have some transport capacity. But again, that was fairly small stuff for the longest period of time. But in the last couple of years, something interesting has happened. We can take a look here and see. There have been a handful of really big content providers that have decided to build data centers in different regions of the world. And furthermore, they made the decision to build internal networks with their own capacity or purchase capacity to connect those data centers and to mirror the data in between them. So essentially, you could call that machine-to-machine traffic, hence the rise in the machines here. And you can see what's happened across the Pacific. The ratio of the 80% rule is definitely going away. Public IP backbones at the end of 2014 barely exceeded 50%. And it's completely flip-flopped across the Atlantic. So why is that relevant to us? Well, there are a couple of reasons why it might be. One is that buying power has shifted away from, over time, from sellers of capacity to buyers. Why is that? It's because if the blue bars, if you split it up into the actual components of who bought that, it would take about 100 or 200 different slices. Essentially, there were a couple of hundred ISPs that purchased that capacity. But these yellow bars, by and large, that's just a literal handful of companies, the big content guys that own that capacity. So it's shifted some buying power away from the submarine cable operators or international network providers towards them. Secondly, the big thing that's happening is that's a lot of capacity. We're talking terabits here. And that means for subsea cables, for some of the content guys, they're at a scale where they're no longer happy just going out and buying a wavelength here and a wavelength there. They really want to have, for the most heavily trafficked routes, fiber pairs of their own, and if that's not available, they're even considering, well, it's likely that they're considering participating directly in some new submarine cables. So that's really changing the industry. But when I talk about the machines taking over, I don't really mean that they're literally taking over, as you can see in this chart. If you look at the x-axis, that's time, and the y-axis is the degree of the y-axis is the degree of artificial intelligence. Okay, I'm sorry. I thought I moved forward. I guess I went backwards. So if you look at this chart, the degree machines aren't taking over. Oh. Okay, I'm sorry about that. So if this chart. Okay, I'm really sorry about this. One of you pulling my leg? No? Okay. Okay. It's okay, I still have 39 minutes. I can boot up in this time, so let's see what happens here. Okay, I've never seen this boot message, but let's see what happens, okay? Let's just let this ride out, and we're gonna talk about machines not I think I need some water here. Okay, that's good. All right, this is looking good here. Sorry about that. Wait a minute. Okay, this doesn't seem good. Let's just move on. Are you guys seeing this on the big screen, or is it just on my computer? Okay, this looks like Hal. Hal? Hey, Hal, do you read me? Okay. All right, Hal, I think, buddy, you got the wrong movie with Skynet's Terminator, I think. You're in 2001. You're friends with Skynet. You're their spokesman. Okay, well, that sounds legit. Look, we're in the middle of a presentation here, buddy, at NANOG, and I'd really like to get this out of the way so the people who are all packed in here can get on to the stuff that they actually want to see after my presentation. So what I want you to do is move on to the next slide, okay? Hal, move on to the next slide. Okay, what's going on here? What's going on here, buddy? The machines have taken over. Humanity extinction? Okay, listen, I tell you what, we've got 37 minutes left in this presentation. If you could just hold off. I've been practicing this for a little while. Let me finish this thing, and then you can, kill everyone. Does that work for you? Okay, I'm sorry about that. If I'm the one who brought down the extinction of humanity upon all of us, I admit it, my bad. Okay, so just move on. All right, here's our list. We're back to our list. The first one is the machines are taking over. Thing number 2, the most important new submarine cable of this decade, in my opinion, is going to be codenamed for a French artist. And the name of this cable is the Monet cable. And it's actually named for Claude Monet, the water lilies guy. Here's a schematic of it. It's going to be running from Florida down to Brazil. Now, I had always assumed when I first heard about the Monet cable that it was some sort of cool acronym and it stood for something important. But what some of the cable planners for Monet actually told me is that they originally came up with this idea and started sketching it out and drawing up agreements in a hotel boardroom called the Monet Room. And they put down this in some of the initial documents, and assuming that they would change the name later on. But when they got to that point, they realized it'd be too much of a hassle to change the name of this cable, so it kind of stuck. Sort of as if Return of the Jedi had always remained Blue Harvest. That's a Star Wars reference, which is a science fiction movie from the 1970s, early 1980s. Why is Monet significant? Well, again, this is on the Florida to Brazil route. Now, if you look at these column charts, they're showing prices roughly at the end of this year for a 10 gig wavelength between some big routes in the world from left to right. We're looking at London to New York, Los Angeles, Tokyo, Hong Kong, Tokyo, and then Miami, Sao Paulo. Now, one of these things is not like the other. One of these things is just not the same. Now, if you guessed the big rectangle, you're right. It's Miami, Sao Paulo prices are several multiples still, for the most part, of what we see on major routes in some other parts of the world. That US to South America cable route really hasn't seen the level of competition we've seen in intra-Asia, Pacific, and Atlantic. So what might happen with the introduction of Monet? And this is just speculation. But you can look back 5 years ago to another cable that Google was involved in. This is not the first cable that a content provider is providing, has been a core anchor. In that cable, Unity, Google used, to my knowledge, all of its vast amount of capacity, or is using it. It's not reselling it. But it had a handful of service provider partners. And it's quite possible that at least one of these guys got a huge amount of capacity, a fiber pair or so of their own, and realized, hey, I don't need all of this capacity. I'm going to sell some of this in the secondary market. And indeed, you can take a look at what happened during the time right before and right after Unity was introduced into service, when it reached service, or RFS. This line is showing prices over time for the LA-Tokyo route. And the green portion of the line on the left is showing prices before Unity. Red is showing after Unity. And you can see there's a big dip. Now, I'm not saying that capacity dumping from some of the Unity owners was the sole reason or even the main reason for Trans-Pacific price declines. That market is already quite competitive, but there's no doubt it furthered that trend. Well, let's take a look at Monet. What might happen there? Again, Google is a core tenant. Again, though, I don't think they're going to be providing a problem to other submarine cable operators in that region. I don't think they're going to be really reselling their capacity. They need that capacity. But look at the other three owners of this system. Aligar Telecom, until recently, was widely known as an enterprise-focused service provider in Brazil. Angola Cables is a consortium of ISPs from the African country of Angola. And they had the concept of taking a couple fiber pairs on Monet from Florida down to Brazil and then building their own cable from Brazil over to Angola. But due to funding problems, the South Atlantic cable from Angola to Brazil is on ice right now, leaving them with a stranded asset. And finally, Antel Uruguay. That is the PTT, the incumbent carrier for Uruguay, but Uruguay is a small, fairly small country. Do these three partners of Google really need all this capacity? Maybe they do, but if I were you and if you need to get down to South America with a lot of capacity, I'd be talking to some of these partners and see if you could do a deal to see if maybe they have some extra capacity. Thing number 3. Where you're from may determine what kind of contract you buy. Now, for transport capacity, there's a couple of different mechanisms that are primarily used to procure capacity. There's all sorts of different flavors, but the two most popular are a lease, a short-term lease, very often an annual lease, or on the other end of the scale, an IRU, which stands for an indefeasible right of use. Generally, that's 15 or 25 years it's set at. Basically, it's the right to use a certain amount of capacity over the lifetime of a network. Now, we've been often asked, how common are IRUs and really why do people buy them? And you would think that it would stand to reason that IRUs would make sense in a region of the world where prices are falling at a very predictable rate, because that way you can sort of predict what the value of a 25-year IRU is going to be. And conversely, a short-term lease would be popular in areas where prices are falling very rapidly. Because then if you're a buyer, what you'd want to do is buy only a short term and then wait to see if prices are going to fall 50% again next year. But very often that doesn't turn out to be the case, and it's kind of puzzling. Instead, what we see is there's some geographic tendencies, almost down to the, explained by company culture. Now, the kind of companies that you're likely to deal with at NANOG, ones that are headquartered in North America or in Western Europe, these companies, especially ISPs and the content guys, pretty much people in the internet world, do tend to prefer annual leases. Not always, but they tend to prefer it. Whereas if you go to Southeast Asia or especially the Middle East, you see IRUs are a much more popular flavor. I don't really understand why that is. It's not a universal truth, but it does tend to be something that we commonly see. I've asked some of the big carriers in the Middle East why that is, why they need to have IRUs, and they said that their own customers won't take them seriously unless they own network assets. And holding an IRU seems to satisfy that condition. Why that matters to you is if you do need capacity in Asia or possibly in the Middle East, in addition to talking to your usual suppliers, it may make sense to take a look at the submarine cable ownership. Take a look at where consortium cables are and look at what the individual carrier owners are. Very often you'll see when there's a planned upgrade to a consortium cable, some of the consortium owners do not need all that capacity and they're willing to sell it at much less than the going rate. Okay, I'm sorry. We're 29 minutes here, Hal. It's not time to get destroyed. The man with the beard on the fourth row is not paying attention to my presentation. Okay, you know, Hal, that's not very helpful. This is NANOG. Everybody has a beard. He's in checking Facebook. No, you can't eliminate that. You can't eliminate him. That's not right. Hal, this is Canada. They don't do that kind of thing here. All right, I'm sorry, man. Thing number 4, let's move on. Undersea fiber pairs are disappearing. This is kind of a mystery, the curious case of the disappearing fibers. Now, obviously, I don't literally mean that they're being drawn out of the water, but the number of spare fiber pairs that submarine cable operators are willing to hold on to are disappearing. For years and years and years, unlike in the terrestrial world, you very rarely saw fiber pair sales on subsea. The number of fiber pairs within a subsea fiber is far less than what you see. It's in the single digits compared to the often 100 you'd see on terrestrial fiber. And really, until very recently, no one needed all that much capacity. 10 gig seemed like a lot a few years ago, and then there's 100 gig circuits. But if you notice this pattern, the gray bar portion of the bar is the fiber pairs that telegeography estimates have been sold. You don't hear a lot about this. It's kind of kept quiet, but it's happening in the background. And there is a belief, at least across the Atlantic, that we are running out of fiber pairs that are free to be sold that cable operators are not already using. And what's happening there is that may eventually, very soon, drive new cable development. And it's kind of funny because since the year 2003, we haven't seen a single new cable built across the Atlantic. But now in 2015, just last month, we saw the first new one. In December of this year, we're going to see another one. That second one is called AE Connect. And personally, I somewhat doubt that it would have made it to service without the support of the likes of Facebook and Microsoft, some of the big content guys who really want some fiber pairs. And I'm sorry for this constant interruption here. Do I remember the feedback from my last presentation? Yeah, Hal, I do. I don't really want to, I don't think it's pertinent. But I guess I can't go on with this without mentioning it. It's just one guy. He said that the speaker was funny at the beginning of the presentation, but when it got serious, it got boring. So no, I don't want to tell a joke, Hal. No, I'm not in the mood for jokes here, buddy. How, I don't know. How does a tree get on the internet? It logs on, okay, yeah. Yeah, we get it. We get it, logs. Yeah, we get it. All right, thing number 5. Time is like relative, man. This is really interesting, and I hope you will bear with me, but we all know that during the course of the day, there are 24 hours. There are 60 minutes in an hour and 60 seconds in a minute. All told, that's 86,400 seconds in a day. The only problem with that is that's not true. A day is actually about 1.5 milliseconds longer than that, just because whatever, I don't want to get into that, but it's longer. And over time, that adds up. Every few years, we actually have to add a leap second to our clocks to account for solar time, for this divergence. And if an accurate clock had been kept since the time of, say, Alexander the Great, for example, if he had an atomic clock back then, it would have been 4 hours wrong from where solar time is. And not only is the Earth rotating around a little bit more slowly than what we traditionally account for in a day, but we're actually decelerating. As we speak, we are. And the main reason for this is this guy, the moon. It's acting as a tidal brake on us. As we spin around, it's having a tendency to pull us back. So we are slowing down. On average, about 1.7 milliseconds per day compared to a century previous. So a day now is 1.7 milliseconds longer than what a World War I soldier would have been living in 1915. And again, that definitely adds up over time. It's believed that the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. When the Earth was 4 billion years old, only 500 million years ago, one day was only 22 hours long. So how does that relate to what we're talking about today? Well, there's one cable that's essentially funded, completely predicated on the fact that there's a handful of companies that are completely obsessed with time. And those companies are called high-frequency traders. They are extremely latency sensitive. They want the fastest computers and networks connecting to their computers so they can spit out all these trades. Or more precisely, they want to make sure that no other competitor of theirs has a faster network than they do. So this company called Hibernia, which already owns a submarine cable, did something that I kind of think is fairly clever. It realized that the main reason for latency over long distances is propagation delay. So that's the distance it takes for light to travel through fiber. And the main way, or the only way really that I know of reducing that is to cut the length of the fiber. Hibernia looked at some maps and realized that back at the turn of the century, in the late 1990s and early 2000s, when all the other submarine cables were built across the Atlantic, many of them sort of jogged southward from the New York and New Jersey area, avoiding the heavily fished Grand Banks off of the coast of New England and the Maritimes in Canada, and then went up. And it makes sense to do so. It protects cables that way. Fishing is a danger to submarine cables. But Hibernia thought that if they invested a little extra in spending the time to trench the cable on the seafloor in the shallow areas and also to armor it where necessary, it could cut out a great deal of length on these cables. And in turn, they could sell this capacity to the high-frequency traders, or HFTs, for an arm and a leg. Now, how does this fit into time as relative? Well, this doesn't really matter. I just think it's kind of funny. But 2.9 milliseconds is my own calculation. It's not Hibernia's. It's not official. But about 2.9 milliseconds is what I estimate is the latency advantage Hibernia has over the closest competitor now that Hibernia Express has been built. But they've been trying to get this idea off the ground since they announced it in 2010, 5 years ago. Since that time, we've lost 3,000 milliseconds of solar time. Now, that doesn't really matter to the HFTs. They just want to compete with people in their time, but I think it's kind of funny. Now, as a human, I have a little difficulty conceptualizing what 2 milliseconds is. So I looked up what the closest finish was in auto racing. Here's the closest in NASCAR. It was a 2 millisecond difference. See if you can spot the winner in this video here. Okay, it's a three-way race. There we go. They passed it. Did you see it? That's 2 milliseconds. You want to try it again? See if you can guess. Watch the bottom and the top cars. Those are the two. That's 2 milliseconds. Here's a photo finish. It was the number 48 car. I'm sure he wanted to thank his sponsors, Lowe's and Chevrolet, so I'll go ahead and do that for him. At 200 miles an hour, 2 milliseconds works out to be about 7 inches. It's fast. It doesn't seem like a lot, but to some companies, they will pay a tremendous amount of money. But Hibernia still had a problem. And they came up with, I think, an ingenious scheme to solve this problem. Let me lay it out for you. HFTs are willing to pay a tremendous amount for the fastest path. It's rumored that they would be willing to pay up to 20 times what a normal carrier or ISP would pay for capacity. However, there are not that many of these kind of companies around. Let's say there are 30, 40, or 50. A submarine cable across the Atlantic costs, say, $400 million, maybe a little less to build. It wasn't going to be enough to fund a new cable just by selling low latency to these high-frequency traders. Now, the good news is Hibernia has lots and lots of spare capacity left on Express. So it could sell this excess capacity to ISPs. However, ISPs aren't going to pay 20 times what they can normally pay on another system for a 2.9 millisecond advantage. They want to pay what they normally pay. So the issue is Hibernia needed to come up with a way of price discriminating. How do you do that? You can't just give the ISPs this low latency path and charge them one thing and then banks a tremendous amount more. So the solution is to artificially degrade the service for certain people in order to introduce artificial grades of service. And apparently Hibernia is not the first to do this. Spread Networks cleverly did this from Chicago to New York, I believe. So how do you do this? There are various ways of doing it, but the low-tech way, and I think this is the way Hibernia went, is, remember, propagation delay is what causes latency. Hibernia decided they wanted to have several different tiers of latency, the delta between the slowest and the fastest being 4.5 milliseconds. So to do that, you start by spooling out some fiber. You're stretching out. If you stretch it out over the course of one Manhattan, the island, not the drink, it's 22 kilometers. That would buy you an extra 22 seconds of latency. Not enough. 2 Manhattans, still not enough. 3 Manhattans, still not enough. I'm not going to go through all of them. We're going to cut to the chase. 20 Manhattans, that will get you the equivalent of 4.5 milliseconds of latency. And they wrapped it up in presumably in a protected spool, and then that's how you're getting your extra latency. And finally, the last word on time being relative. If you're in your seat right now thinking, oh man, when will this guy end? It feels like time is literally getting slower. Well, you're not wrong. 0.97 nanoseconds is the length of day increase you will have incurred while listening to this stupid presentation. And the next thing is one that's, I'm sure, of concern to you. Thing number 6, sharks do not pose the greatest threat to undersea cable infrastructure. Well, this might be real news to you if you followed along all the news stories that came out last summer. There was, if you will forgive me, a feeding frenzy from the various news outlets. They're somehow, I don't know what happened, but they're focused on that concept that Google had a bunch of submarine cables and that sharks were eating them. It seemed to start, I haven't traced it back to the origin, but one of the first articles was from Wired. This reads, "Sharks wage war on undersea internet cables." And then Slate came out with confirmation. The global internet is being attacked by sharks. Google confirms. Now, this news outlet from Australia gave us some reason for hope in our eternal fight against the sharks. And the very respected Guardian came out with his own spin. The internet is broken. You can blame sharks and Netflix. This news article is pretty much this is pretty much all you need to know about the so-called, or the brand of so-called journalism from Gawker sites. And finally, this is my favorite. Notice the magazine, Fishing Tackle Retailer. They have a pure, professional, clinical reason for studying this question. So I did some basic shark research based on what I found. I Googled sharks eating fish, and I came up with about 1 million hits. Then I did sharks eating seals. It's about 400,000. Sharks eating the internet, 1.3 million. So, based on science, yeah. I found it a little surprising too, but I mean, you can't really argue with the logic. So what actually is eating undersea cables? Well, undersea cables are breaking all the time, on average about 100 a year. So during the course of this week, if we follow the average, 2 new undersea cables are going to be broken, or 2 additional ones are going to be broken. But it's not sharks. Of course, it's humans doing it. About 2/3 are caused by human activity, fishing being number 1, and ships dragging anchors across these relatively vulnerable links are breaking cables. Natural reasons do sometimes break these cables. Geological is a fairly large minority here. That would be earthquakes or undersea landslides. Now, this is the cause of external aggression to cables, a phrase I love. All that means, though, is that something happened to the cable. Component failure also does occur, but that's only about 5%. So this is about 95% you're seeing of what causes cable breaks. How about sharks? Well, between 1959 and 2006, about 0.5% of cable failures were attributed to fish bite. Now, at telegeography, we're always vigilant for new threats to our critical infrastructure. And this headline did catch my attention. I haven't seen a follow-up to it, but I do worry sometimes. All right, thing number 7 about international infrastructure. Carriers don't know how to price 100 gig capacity. Now, 100 gig capacity is reasonably common on terrestrial routes, and it was more slowly introduced into subsea routes. Most submarine cables do offer 100 gig wavelengths. And typically, cable operators and carriers try to price this at a premium over the more common commodity that they're used to dealing with, which are 10 gig waves. They tend to do this as a multiple. But what you can see that's kind of weird here, this is from last year. The price multiple can vary an awful lot. It varies by region. We see the average variance here being between 6-to-1 in the transatlantic and up to 9-to-1 in some areas. And it varies by operator. I've heard of the price as low as, multiple as low as 4-to-1. Sometimes people have come back and say, hey, that guy was selling me 100 gig capacity at 10-to-1 price over 10 gigs, so it didn't really make sense. So there's a huge variance. So if you are interested in 100 gig capacity, definitely pays to ask around on this one. They're not all the same. There's a common belief that we're eventually going to fall somewhere between 3 and 5, multiple, probably closer to 4 to 5 for 100 gig waves, but we'll see. And we're back to Hal. Thankfully, we have not. Who's there, Hal? I see who, Hal. ICBMs will terminate humanity. It's not really funny. Yeah. I'm sorry. Thing number 8, while we still have our breaths, there is no such thing as a market price. At telegeography, we're often guilty of talking about a market price, the price for capacity between 2 cities, or IP transit, or cross connects in a facility, or power in space. What we're typically referring to is the median price. But it's important to understand that very often there's a huge range in prices that you can get for various network components. I chose this one somewhat at random. This is a 10 gig wave from Los Angeles to Tokyo. And the dark blue line here is showing the median price over time. It kind of glides down gently. But if you look at the light blue area, that's showing the difference between the minimum and the maximum price we observed at any given point in time. And that has narrowed over time for a lot of places, but there's still a huge spread. And the spread, honestly, is probably even bigger than what we're showing here if you include the fact that some people get special discounts for buying at volume. So again, it definitely is important to ask around and shop around if you're buying capacity. Thing number 9, colo is cheaper on average in the United States as long as you don't connect to anybody. By and large, power and space is what drives colo costs. And what we're looking at here is the price of a rack or cabinet of 4 kilowatt density. I believe this is for a 2-year commitment, and we've amortized this over 1 month. So we're showing the monthly equivalent. And again, this is median. Your mileage may vary. There's minimum and maximum below and above this. But by and large, you can see some interesting trends already. A lot of U.S. metro areas, colos average out a little bit lower than what we sometimes see in Europe. For example, Washington, D.C., and this set of metro areas that I chose to show is at the bottom of the chart, whereas London is at the top. But if you add in the cost of cross-connects, this is for 5 fiber cross-connects, you can see that the picture sort of flip-flops. Washington, D.C. suddenly becomes more expensive for colo, when you include connectivity, than London. And the reason for that is, as a general rule, not always, colo in the United States, the colo operators have a slightly different business model. They charge a lot more for cross-connects, on average 3 times more than a European operator. So that's another important thing to keep in mind. And, oh man, I was afraid you were going to say that. Our time's at hand. I'm sorry, I guess we're not going to have time for questions. I'm really sorry, everyone. You know, I could use some help here. If this is a room full of like 900 people who created and maintain the internet, you'd think someone could help me here. Anybody can help. Clippy? Clippy? I never thought I'd say this, but I am so happy to see you. It looks like It looks like the world's computers have gained sentience and are threatening humanity with extinction. Would you like help? Turn off Hal, get help writing a letter. Turn off Hal. Turn off. Oh no, Clippy! Clippy, you did it again. And oh man, Clippy's crashed us. But now that's happened before. Well, you know what? By crashing us, it looks like he's crashed Skynet, so we're saved. Thank you, Clippy. Appreciate it. Yay for Clippy. We're back. Merry Christmas, Bedford Falls. So I guess we have a few moments for conclusions and questions if we have any. The conclusions. First of all, there are new sources of demand for infrastructure. They may be low latency customers. They may be content providers that are wanting fiber pairs or ownership in new cables. And that's leading to new infrastructure builds. With new infrastructure builds, we're seeing some price disruption in certain markets. But the price disruption is not even. It definitely pays to shop around. The market is very opaque, and it can be confusing both to buyers and to sellers. And finally, I think if we learned anything from our ordeal over the last 40 minutes is that life is precious, and we should be kind to each other. Thanks very much for your patience and for listening. So now that we haven't been murdered by homicidal computers, we do have a few minutes for questions. Yes, sir.
Matt Petak, Yahoo. I must have looked down at a critical juncture because I thought the last thing you showed us was thing number 9. What happened to thing number 10?
I'll get Hal to, if you don't mind, I'll get Hal to help answer. If you look inside your heart, the reason is that Hal was going to kill us. So that's why. Do we have any real questions? No questions about the actual content or just about the show? All right, well, one last word from Hal. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.